on life course analysis with Indigenous Australian gambling trajectories. This research was conducted with my colleague Professor Nerily Hing. It was funded by an Australian Research Council Discovery Grant, and I'm very grateful to the participation of the Indigenous Australians who supported the research. Oh, great. So a little bit about life course analysis first. It's an interdisciplinary framework that is increasingly used to chart social science research into human behaviour. And it charts life trajectories from childhood to adulthood, examining dynamic influences of societal structuring, such as norms around age and family, work and leisure, and individual actions, the choices people make, and of course the resources that they have available to use. So the focus is on both critical short-term transition points in life, such as turning 18 years and being legally allowed to gamble, as they are embedded in long-term, usually age-related trajectories. And that might be including family histories or work patterns and leisure patterns. So 4 concepts crucial for understanding sequential age-related human development and adaptation are the interplay between human lives and the historical content, and how those social forces and conditions affect what people do. For instance, in Indigenous Australian life, there's been a long history of horse racing, working with horses on farms and stations, racing and training horses, owning horses, and meeting up with kin and extended family at the racetrack, picnic races or city races, and having family time together. So that is there's a very close attachment there embedded in that historical context. In terms of social embeddedness and linked lives, that revolves around life cycle sequences. And interdependence assumes that there are relationships between individuals and then between families and communities. And that people are linked in many ways. For instance, some First Nations groups, traditional gambling is embedded in some community life. And so there is an acceptance of that as part of the community and cultural background. Timing of life events and the transitions that brings can vary. And for instance, in terms of social roles, events and intergenerational transmission, Indigenous Australians generally have a low life expectancy. And so that older family members and elders may not survive to be sources of advice and assistance to younger people for that transmission of history, and also for advice in becoming a leader and elder in the community. And this traditionally has been probably the most important source of advice and assistance in the past. And human agency, of course, is the choice that people make. It's the ability to choose roles and situations for ourselves. And so some people choose to gamble and some people don't. So in adopting a life course approach, both theoretically and methodologically, we're trying to use this model to expand knowledge about the influences shaping Indigenous gambling. So the aim of this particular project was to analyse Indigenous Australians' gambling trajectories from childhood to adulthood using the sociological life course approach, and specifically to examine the transitions resulting in controlled or recreational gambling and uncontrolled or more disordered gambling. And the rationale behind that was that, as I mentioned earlier, some Indigenous cultures include gambling as both a sacred and secular activity, and so acceptance is high on cultural grounds. and people may be potentially more vulnerable to gambling-related issues than other people. Acceptance and access have already been proven as important variables for gambling as an adult. And gambling has been a very common recreational activity for Indigenous Australians over a long time. Indigenous gambling is characterised by access to unregulated gambling at home, on cards and within communities, as well as access to commercial gambling in venues. And as a small marginalised population group, capturing Indigenous perspectives in national surveys is very difficult, and we're trying to use this method to gain a better understanding of gambling trajectories. Current research indicates that Indigenous people who gamble on commercial forms face higher risks of gambling-related problems. And as a minority group, a very small minority group, about 2.5% of the population, Indigenous Australians live in dual society. They live with an Indigenous world and a non-Indigenous world, and this duality has implications for their life course patterns. Good, all working. So in terms of methods, we struggle through ethics applications and won approval from the Aboriginal Health and Medical Research Council and a university board, and it was passed through our College of Indigenous Partners through the university approval. But this had been preceded by a series of projects, research projects, developed through respectful community consultations over a 5-year period. So it was never a one-off project. It had been developed and conducted with consultation and consent at each stage. The project was qualitative, unlike some of our earlier research, and we used interpretive phenomenological analysis to do the interpretations. For cultural sensitivity and consistency, one Aboriginal researcher conducted all of the telephone interviews, and she'd been trained and had had similar research experience with other projects. So we conducted telephone interviews with this project. They focused on exposure to gambling, engagement in gambling, its influences and the consequences through four broad chronological age periods. So this is the sample by age and gender. People were needed to be Indigenous Australian and of the legal age to gamble over 18 years. We had a database of about 250 people, so we were able to randomly select a number. We had 57 people who agreed to participate and about 6 refusals. Most people lived in the 2 states of Queensland and New South Wales. The sample was aged from 18 to 71, most being in the 30 to 60 age bracket and slightly more women than men. In terms of gambling exposure and engagement by age and gender, this table shows that first of all, the 4 broad chronological age periods, and how we were able to analyse the data in those 4 periods. You'll notice that in the early age groups we asked about gambling exposure, and later we asked about exposure and engagement. So getting on to the results for the first age group, the under 13 years group. Master themes here were focused on social linkages and dependence. So maintaining close family and kin networks, depending on others, were closely linked to early childhood gambling exposure. Most participants, 46 out of 57, recalled gambling as being part of their early childhood memories. And most of it was centred on horse racing and traditional card playing. There were strong physical and social and cultural links recalled by the participants. And in that first quote, you'll see a lot of family members were involved in greyhound racing. We had greyhounds, other families had greyhounds, we trained them, we raced them, and we all went to the races. Likewise, another person recollected watching and learning gambling rules and rituals in family homes, playing bingo at home, playing cards in the backyard, with grandmother taking her and helping her along. So feelings of belonging, social embeddedness were reported as being linked to an awareness of the rules and rituals of gambling. These families shared a cultural history of gambling that extended over time and space. For the quote given by the third person, a grandfather provided close family support and a stable role model. He had difficulties with his immediate family gambling with his mother and her friends, and found stability and emotional regulation with his grandfather. So important transitions appeared to be steered by life course trajectories where intergenerational dependence were apparent. And these young people absorbed or reported absorbing values, attitudes and behaviours from important social agents at critical stages of development. Moving on to the second group, a little bit more rebellious, a little bit more risk-taking, a teenage group who were growing in independence and in human agency or making choices for themselves. Now at this age, it was illegal to gamble and most didn't gamble. And the non-gamblers were aware of the legal constraints. Some had home rules about gambling, not gambling. Some were very poor and just didn't have the money. And some had seen adverse effects in their families. For those gamblers who were probably more risk takers than the others, horse betting and cards at home were the preferred forms and probably the most accessible forms as well. An important contextual difference arose in this group, and that was seen as moving from cards to commercial gambling. Gambling in a venue appeared to be very similar to card gambling at home, but card gambling at home was steeped in historical patterns of collective society. And these two forms of gambling have different goals. Commercial gambling aims to make a profit for the operator. Card gambling, on the other hand, usually sustains social relationships and cultural norms. Thus, a carryover of historical attitudes, cultural values and behaviour into the commercial context caught some people unawares, and some of them suffered from negative outcomes. And you'll see from those two quotes that it was good, people said it was good for us to get together at cards around home, but for some, gambling in a venue became negative as people went into town to do other things, went to the clubs and got caught up with the same attitudes they had to card gambling. So risk-taking behaviour at this time increased as people's physical and social world expanded, and peers began to exert more pressure as primary socialising agents. One participant said he gambled weekly on horse racing with his teenage friends, spending about $80 to $130 each session, and observed that peer pressure for him was a very forceful influence. And in a culturally important way, Indigenous teenagers, as a minority group living in a dual world, may have sought strong friendship bonds and collective bonds of safety with Indigenous peers due to their need for some safety with others and to the generally disadvantaged social circumstances. So this period of rapid individual change and teen exposure to risk and risky behaviour appears to have had very strong effects on their development. Moving on to the third age group, young adults, the 18 to 30-year-olds. This was a period, a time of major shifts and transitions, which is a key feature of life course analysis. Most participants gambled and they preferred poker machines. The transition point at 18 years, with the legal ability to gamble, to consume alcohol and drive cars, opened up the world to many people, the adult world, and those activities became an initial rite of passage. Often there was a honeymoon period where risky behaviour was part of that behaviour at the time, with initiation into the adult world. The major trajectory shifts followed different transition points, often leading to fluctuating gambling participation. As initial interest grew and waned, other life events, critical points, took precedence. Things like moving out of home, getting a job, maybe starting a relationship or having children. All of those, of course, took their toll and initial interest waned. Participants experienced turning points and entered into transition periods, often reducing gambling in a maturing out way. And that quotation about turning 18, spending a lot of money and realising that it wasn't being very productive, that there were other events that took priority, and that this person evolved from more or less uncontrolled to controlled gambling, showing a distinct transition from experimentation and risk towards maturity and mindfulness. His recovery demonstrated a shift in perception and practice about managing gambling as a recreation activity. So apart from a few participants who continued on that trajectory of disordered gambling, some stopped gambling, some reduced through having set limits, and some continued to gamble within the set limits, but still felt a little tested when they visited gambling venues. Moving on to the final age group, the fourth age group of mature adults from 31 to 65. A master theme for this group was the rationalisation of gambling and the interplay of human life and history. So in this group, there was one large group of people who gambled weekly or fortnightly, spending about $10 to $50 per session, but generally discretionary gambling expenditure was related to income, and events and transitions produced mobility in and out of gambling. For instance, changing family circumstances usually determined these decisions. As one person said, as she was growing older, she felt a timely need for solidarity with kinfolk. And another said the interplay between collective family values, timing of health crises, family disaster impacts and growing children's needs spurred them to reduce their gambling. And you'll see that in those first two quotes. On the other hand, some women increased their gambling as a transition to freedom. They took time out for themselves, they relinquished their ethic of care as older adulthood approached, and they had time for themselves. They said, I didn't have any more responsibilities, I could afford to do this, and I was bored at home. And for some, Contextual elements of society and history affected the processes of ageing and loss. Some had sought formal assistance or used self-help and family assistance to reduce their gambling. So one person managed to overcome some gambling-related problems by having her debts paid before her salary was banked. For another, finding a long-term solution for recovery was an important gambling transition. It meant moving from a disordered struggle to some limited and yet controlled gambling. This particular participant was a traditional Indigenous artist, and he went back to painting. He set limits on his money and also took up his favourite occupation. The realisation that life needed to change was a turning point preceding this transition. So those quotes illustrate those major themes. Now, this is a fantastic diagram, and thanks to Neroli for putting all this together, because it shows the major sequential influences on gambling trajectories for the participants. So we combined these major conceptual influences, dependence, independence, major shifts and rationalisations, as they appeared in the participants' life courses. The dotted lines on the outside of the figure represent dynamic movements and influences moving back and forth between the participants' gambling trajectories, their cultural values, environment, history, social norms, kinship and socialisation. Now, the aim of this figure is not to reduce the complex nature of gambling by Indigenous Australians, but to a very stable or fixed process, but to show that there is a lot of flexibility within this phenomenon. There were, of course, some limitations. The sample was small and self-selected. Only the name, age and phone number was recorded, and location details might have added some comparative value. While recall will contain biases, we did check for inconsistencies through the interviews. And in conclusion, being a recreational or disordered gambler was very dynamic, and it often depended on the density of social networks, changing contextual circumstances and individual actions. Two crucial differences between recreational and disordered gamblers were, first, the strength and density of social networks. These were shown through the transmission of Indigenous cultural values and family bonds. And where these were strong, generally speaking, there was a pattern of recreational gambling. Where social bonds were disintegrating or were weak, where people became isolated, a pattern of disordered gambling was more likely. And that was for most age groups. However, for teenagers, strong peer bonds were often associated with more disordered gambling, with a general pattern of risky behaviour and growing independence. In terms of changing gambling context, the transmission of gambling values, attitudes and behaviours from card gambling in a homely or kin context to commercial gambling within a market context appeared to confuse some people. They seemed to hold similar gambling expectations of winning and sharing in both contexts, and gambled in a more disordered way on commercial gambling. This difference was very obvious in the late teen groups and young adult groups. And so their life course trajectories were very dynamic and volatile. Individual actions suggest that natural recovery from gambling problems may be more the rule than the exception. Participants' gambling was volatile and fluid. subject to transitions and turning points. So a recreational gambler may evolve into a disordered gambler, experience some level of recovery and regain their recreational status. So these findings show that life course histories of gambling involving gambling-related problems appear more frequently to be transitory and episodic than stable and constant. The ebb and flow of gambling involvement, of recreational and disordered gambling here, show the efforts that people make by themselves and with their families to overcome their problems. And transitions found here reflect and confirm changing patterns of gambling over time. So these results provide some deeper information and understanding about gambling involvement by Indigenous Australians, but simultaneously support some more general research findings on gambling histories and fluctuations over time. So we found the sociological life course analysis very useful in this instance to enhance the theoretical understanding of gambling trajectories and transitions associated with recreational and disordered gambling. And finally, some practical implications. We think there might be an opportunity here for more intensive use of the gambling continuum for identifying gambling trajectories and transitions through life course analysis of different groups of gamblers. And from a practical point of view, public health policies could be specifically targeted at gambling transitions to help develop protective interventions at discrete points. And thus, there would be a need to involve Aboriginal communities and get their input through their women's groups or men's groups or justice groups to be engaged in developing strategies for gambling to help enhance positive features, to reduce negative aspects, especially in community education on self-help and informal help within family and kin networks. So, that's all I have to say, unless I have some questions.
Thank you, Helen.